Great. Okay, so I think we will get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Lerner. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause New York, and I'm so glad you could join us for tonight's town hall. We'll be doing these every Thursday at 6:30 p.m. for the foreseeable future. We'll be keeping you posted on what's going on with our priority issues, and we'll bring in special guest speakers, as we have tonight, on a range of topics. Feel free to let us know who you'd like to hear from in the future. Tonight, we're pleased to be joined by civil rights lawyer and MSNBC contributor Maya Wiley. Before we get started, though, we want to outline our agenda for the call and go over some of the Zoom features that we will be using. Tonight, first we'll be talking to our guest, Maya Wiley, about the way in which the pandemic has starkly revealed inequalities in our society and how awareness of those inequalities should shape both the stimulus response and the recovery. Following my discussion with Maya, I will give you a short update on actions that have impacted our June primary and what we're doing to minimize the possibility that voters will be disenfranchised because of those changes. And then we'll take questions and answers. We encourage you to submit your questions in the chat as we go. Afterwards, I'll briefly, we'll be using the Zoom chat. To access the chat, click on the speech bubble icon titled Chat at the bottom of your screen. That'll open the chat, and at the bottom you'll see a field where you can type up your questions. Please make sure to hit enter and include your name and your zip code with your question so we know where you're coming from. During the call, we'll also ask you to answer several questions about ways you can get involved helping to protect our democracy. We'll share a link to the poll in the chat. Just click on the link to participate in our poll. We're recording the meeting and posting it up on our website. You can view some of our previous town halls and our first ever book club event there and on our YouTube channel. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Maya Wiley, who is a university professor at the New School. She's a nationally renowned expert on racial justice and equity. She's litigated, lobbied the US Congress, and developed programs to transform structural racism in the US. Oh. Sorry about that. In the US and in South Africa. Maya is also a legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC and a frequent contributor to leading news outlets. Prior to the New School, Maya was counsel to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. Maya is also a 2019 recipient of Common Cause New York's Champion of Democracy Award and a longtime friend of Common Cause New York. Maya, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you, especially you, Susan.
You are on mute.
Ah, I am. Okay.
Not hearing you.
Not hearing. Let me make sure it's my.
I can hear Maya.
We can hear Maya.
Yep, you got me.
No, you're
No?
not. I'm not showing you as being muted, but you're not coming through. The mic's not picking you up.
Yeah. We can hear you, Maya.
I'm hearing some people saying they can hear me.
This is Sandy Hicker. I hear you clearly.
I hear you, Maya.
Can you hear us?
Susan, you got a crappy mic.
No.
So
Alexis. Susan, make sure that Susan, make sure that you haven't muted.
You're not muted on our side.
You gotta tell her that.
So others can hear. Okay.
Well,
Are you sure it's him?
Susan can't.
It's me. It's me.
Oh my
Totally me.
gosh.
I'm sorry. Got it. Okay.
Oh, now
well,
I can hear.
Okay, Maya, thank you. Thank you for your patience while I adjusted my speaker.
Oh, no problem. We are all living technological difficulty as well as the crisis of this pandemic. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yes,
you know, Maya, one of the things that is really striking me during this crisis period is, you know, the fact that actually I'm relatively safe.
Okay,
I
I'll go
have
upstairs.
a comfortable place to sequester with just my husband. I've got a nice backyard that I can go out and not worry about running into other people. But that's really not the experience of many other New Yorkers. And I thought we might start by talking about some of the ways in which there is a difference in how New Yorkers are experiencing this emergency.
Absolutely. And I both share your sense of gratitude for my own privilege. I am in a similar situation in a community though where many in my community are not. And I think that one of the things that is true of New York City is that every single experience of a crisis that we have had, whether it was this pandemic, whether it was Hurricane Sandy, whether it was the Great Recession before that, has always shown us what we walk past every single day in this city, which is a tremendous amount of inequality. And one of the things that's really so important to your point, Susan, about housing overcrowding, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about in terms of whether we can keep ourselves safe as we're working to pay attention to what our health experts are telling us to do to be safe, requires housing that our policies have both failed to produce, right? We have over 40% of the city paying much more than they can afford for housing. And that's true both of the middle class, and of course it's true for low income people, many of whom are working, and in some instances are paying 50% of their rent, even though they're in rent stabilized units. So one of the things that tells us is obviously the rent's too damn high. And we haven't had enough of a federal or state or local housing policy that helps fix affordability. But when we're talking about race, we're talking about affordability, of course, but we're talking about all of the history of race discrimination that has resulted in exactly what we're seeing today in housing. And what I mean by that is we have made decisions in this country, for example, coming out of the Great Depression, where we designed housing around racial segregation. And we did it intentionally. It was explicit when we had federal housing policies that said, we will help you, 50% of our mortgage financing in this country was backed by the federal government. But it said that if you're in an integrated neighborhood, we will downgrade the credit worthiness of homeowners in that neighborhood so that it was less likely that banks would want to underwrite those mortgages. And if you just think about what we saw during Hurricane Sandy in the Far Rockaways, I don't know, for those of you who remember, Far Rockaways, very, very hard hit, lots of low income people of color in the Far Rockaways, and a lot of them paying way too much for housing. But also the reason that they were there is because of some decisions Robert Moses made to push poor people of color to what is now vulnerable community in the face of climate change. And we often forget to make the appropriate investments in resilience. So there are a lot of things going on there, and you know, I think of these things as stools. You know, it's never just one leg. So affordability is one piece, but it leads a lot of people to say, well, people are choosing where they live. Well, no, of course not. If you can't afford to live where you want to live, you live where you can afford. But in addition to policy, it's the fact that we are more likely to see people of color in low wage work that doesn't provide benefits. They might not have paid sick leave, and they are working very hard, but it's not enough to keep pace with their very real costs of living. So all of those are important factors, and some that some of us can take for granted, and unfortunately too many people of color in the city cannot.
So what does that militate for what we should be doing in this crisis, right? What should we expect our government to do when we're facing these sorts of disparities that have been developed systemically?
Yeah, I think we should do what we've always, you know, one of the things about crisis is the opportunity is people see things that people of color have been seeing every day of their lives, but maybe they're seeing it in different ways and for the first time. And that's important, right? We do need to see what we have to fix. But we have very smart people, Common Cause, one of the major organizations among them, but many others, some I know who are on this Zoom right now, who have been coming up with proposals for years that go right to the heart of the conditions that we have designed. These are not natural conditions. They're a result of making bad decisions or not being willing to make some good decisions. So let's just give some examples. One is having a framework on both spending and budget cutting that takes into account where we should be investing and where we don't need to invest. In other words, you put a racial equity lens and a gender equity lens and an economic deprivation lens on the parts of the city that have been hard hit that cannot afford, for example, not to have a summer youth program, that cannot afford to see budget cuts to education programs, including after-school programs, that cannot afford to not have a solution to the very real rent crisis that's impacting not just renters in terms of their residents, but also the small mom and pop businesses that are so often how people are keeping food on the table, as well as serving their community. So those are just some, but I think if we literally looked at what we have as assets in the city, and we forget sometimes that we have assets in every single community in this city, and that includes communities of color. We have people who do amazing things, whether it's in the creative arts. We have nonprofit organizations that do incredible things with very little and who add real value to solving the problems in communities. And we have to look at those assets and figure out how to keep and support them. The other thing I would say we have to do is really actively and continue to do battle with the federal government for a very real bailout of states. I mean, there's no question that the crisis that we face, both in the city, in the state, is also a crisis that's produced by a federal government that's refusing a $500 billion bailout that Democrat and Republican governors are demanding just to keep the lights on and be able to preserve things like education and preserve social service programs and pay out unemployment insurance and figure out more supports for small mom and pop shops and all the various things that we need to continue to do and build upon.
Well, but isn't part of the problem also that the money that has been handed out actually has been exacerbating the inequities?
Well, yes, and this just, yes, and we all should be really upset about this, right? Okay, we're fighting about paid sick leave. There's one example, right? That we need, everybody should be able to stay home if they're sick or they need to take care of a sick family member without worrying about whether they're going to be able to buy bread to put on the table. That one, at least we're talking actively about, and thankfully healthcare has been a big part of this presidential cycle and what we're talking about. But on the small business side, and I know that's one of the reasons you're asking me, but women and minority of all races and businesses owned by people of color, many of them are also immigrants, are actually a huge part of our economy, and they're a huge part of our economy in low-income communities.
And they're also part of the culture of our city. It's what makes
absolutely
the city livable.
And it also makes it enjoyable. Like we literally, some of the things that attract people here, people want to go on neighborhood tours when they come to New York as tourists, because it's interesting to see how neighborhoods are different and be in a city where we don't have cookie cutter communities. I mean, there's a benefit in so many ways to the city. And I'll also say that a lot of the small businesses that we're talking about, even when they're not able to pay their own rent, even when they're not sure how they're keeping their doors open, they're the ones pulling together food drives for people in their neighborhoods who are hungry. They're the ones who are finding ways to, just do whatever they can as anchors in their community to help. And it's been astounding and in a really, really wonderful and gratifying way to see that. but heartbreaking that we don't make really obvious decisions. And one really obvious decision, when you think about the grants and loan programs for small businesses, is that we said first come, first serve. First come, first serve. First in the door. Well, once you say that, all you're going to do is privilege businesses that have lawyers, that have banking relationships already, so they can go straight to a bank that already sees them as a client, and that knows how to navigate a lender process. Our small mom and pop shops, some of them didn't even have banking relationships with banks who were participating in the loan program. They were scrambling to find banks that might take them. Some banks were saying, well, we're going to serve, even if you were small and could get yourself in there with an application, they were going to serve their big clients first.
Right.
And even the ones, because we do have banks that were trying really hard. I don't want to put all banks in one category, that really were trying to serve businesses. But the small ones have much harder time showing and demonstrating their payroll. They just don't keep their books in the same way.
But
So
there are ways to address that, right?
Of course.
I mean, who is responsible ultimately for being sure that the program is set up correctly?
Well, this is exactly the point. Is I think we have multiple opportunities to make this better, and I am confident. While we're in the middle of a second round on support for small businesses, let me say two things. The federal government, I think SBA really tried hard, but the programs were set up in such a way that they were, by definition, were going to discriminate. And I don't mean that as an intention. I'm just saying, if you're not taking into account that in this country, we have 30 million of our small businesses, about 28 million of them are self-employed businesses. They're small, they're micro. How do you make sure you design so that they're set asides? Because those people are the same people you want to keep their 3 or 4 employees, often that are from their community, and you want them to be able to keep food on the table and be able to avoid unemployment insurance if they would rather stay in business. Obviously, they can make a choice, but that, just designing it with that in mind, rather than saying 500 employees makes you small. Yes, and I'm not opposed to businesses that have 500 employees getting help to keep those employees paid. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. It's that it was never enough money, and it was never designed to help the Main Street, to help the real small businesses that this country loves to tout. The second thing I'll say, well, okay, just one on SBS, because at the city level, there was no state program. At the city level, SBS, our Small Business Services, actually does a really good job of trying to help give capacity to support to small businesses so they can access the programs. But again, here's a good lesson here, and I think they're thinking about this, is it shouldn't have been first come, first serve at the city level. That at the city level, we have a much better sense of how we can create on-ramps for our small businesses. They had much less money than the federal government, and because the city didn't create a 100% loan guarantee like the federal government, it was very hard for the city to get more funds into their small business program. But they typically do a better job making it easier for small businesses and getting them through the process.
So 2 things. One, I want to point out, I mean, you and I have been talking about New York City. That happens to be where we live, but the same thing is true throughout our state. The fabric of our communities, the baseline of our economy, are the small businesses, the entrepreneurs, the mom and pop shops that make a particular small town a more interesting place to be than, the place that is going to rely on the outskirts Walmart.
That's right.
You've talked about the city. These choices are being made by somebody. I am going to ask you, I'm not naming names in the sense of this one elected, but rather what levels of government, who should we be directing our expectations to in setting up a first in gets the money situation? Is that Congress? Is that the Trump administration? The city, obviously, was that the mayor? Is that the city council? And why didn't the state provide that kind of funding?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to the state question. I do think we have to push it at every level. I mean, the good thing about New York is we have a very strong New York delegation in Congress. And Nydia Velasquez, who is our Congress member from Brooklyn, happens to also chair the Small Business Committee. And she's been a huge champion for this. So Hakeem Jeffries, I mean, we have many. I shouldn't have started the list because there's actually a long list of elected officials who have absolutely understood that what was done was not good enough and that we have to do better. You're absolutely right to say it's a state issue. First of all, we have cities all around the state. New York is not the only city in the state. I happen to have been born in Syracuse, so I am evidence of that. But it's also that we're a rural state, and you're absolutely right. This is true of rural communities. Agriculture was a little different because their programs weren't through small business. It was through U.S. Department of Agriculture. But the point is, absolutely, there is going to be another round, I suspect, or another fight about having another round of funding. We should be supporting our delegation, making sure they have available to them the anecdotes. We've been, you know, I with a friend, Justin Hendricks, set up a very small volunteer network called Flatbush Thrives. By the way,
asking you about it.
Yeah, well, anyone who either wants to volunteer or knows businesses that might benefit, send them to our website, www.flatbushthrives.org. Yes, we say Flatbush because we in Flatbush, but it really is, we'll help anybody. And our volunteers are phenomenal people. But the point is, feeding those anecdotes that really says, no, it does have to be a set aside. By the way, at this point, after 2 rounds, I think it has to be a rent grant. Our small businesses are saying, you know, payroll, I'm trying to stay in my space and a loan isn't going to help me. It's just not. We're at a point where they have to get bailout grants on rent if they have any hope of staying in their commercial space. Plus, you know, frankly, some of the landlords are small in and of themselves. You know, we had an auto body shop where the auto body shop owner, he's a small business. He's just a small community businessman, but he also happened to own the apartment building, a small apartment building. He just told his renters that he wasn't expecting them to pay the rent and that he wanted them to take care of themselves. I mean, so actually it'd be great if we would actually give rent grants, because it's not just the renters we're helping, we're also helping another part of our economy that often also are not big businesses themselves. So that's something we should do. But you're absolutely right that this is a time to say to the state, how are we going to have budget cuts that don't use a lens that ensures that we're not cutting the wrong things like we do every single time? I mean, every single time, if we lose sight of the fact that there's some money we just should not cut, and we have to find cuts in a different way. If we have to do it in a way that takes into account those who need it the most and don't penalize them because they need it the most.
So I want to pick up on something you said, because I think it really addresses an issue that we've been struggling with at Common Cause internally, and that we have discussions with our activists all the time. So when we ask people to get in touch with their congressional representative and, you know, advocate for a particular position, often the response we get is, my member of Congress is really good on that. You know, they don't need to hear from me on that. And our feeling is, number one, yes, they do need to hear. They need to know that the work they're doing is appreciated and supported by their constituents. But the idea of collecting stories, firsthand experiences that they can use in press stories, in briefings, in arguments and conversations with other members of Congress who may not realize the impact of some of the draconian measures that they want to impose, is really, I think, a really interesting idea, and one that is important for all of us on this Zoom call to think about. What are the stories that we have that really illustrate the impact of the pandemic on our communities and the kind of assistance that we need to have the same quality of life, the same vibrant economy and community that we all chose by living someplace in New York, either in the city or upstate in a small town or a smaller city.
And yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's especially important because we also have the state to think about and the city. As you said earlier, it is all three levels of government. So critical that we focus right now on Congress and getting another package out and getting it shaped better. But even that's not going to be enough if we're looking at, you know, what our solutions are and how we're recovering, and we're not doing it in a way that says, let's not repeat the same mistakes we make each time, because every time we make them and then another bad thing happens, we feel bad all over again. Why don't we just stop feeling bad? Why don't we do it right? Why don't we learn from our past? And there's so many lessons we have to draw from, whether it's the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, or, you know, Hurricane Sandy, or any number of others. We can even go back to the Great Depression and point out both what worked and helped people and what excluded communities of color and low-income communities in rural areas too. So I think this idea of getting people engaged and talking, including to their electeds, does matter, even if it's a thank you for doing the right thing. And also, even the congressional delegation has conversations with city council, has conversations with the state. They do talk to one another. So it's also a good way to be expanding the political bandwidth for the right conversation about the lens we should use on the impact that we need to have on our vulnerable and hard hit people.
Yeah, exactly. I want to go back to Flatbush Thrives because I'm kind of intrigued by it. And I wanted to ask you to spend a little more time describing what it is, because is it a model that other neighborhoods and other places across the state might want to adopt?
Well, I am trying not to cry because, you know, one of the things that makes this city great is that people step up. People really step up, and they step up in a crisis even when they don't have anything themselves. And, you know, to me, one of the things that's amazing about, so Flatbush Thrives, again, a friend of mine who happens to run the media lab at NYU, he and I have done other kinds of work together, both as university faculty members, but also on impeachment, some other things. And he and I were just, he also lives in Flatbush. You know, he's saying, we've got to do something, we've got to do something. I was like, right. But I was looking at the beauty salon, you know, down the street, where I was like, the beauty salon down the street, does not even know these programs exist, let alone what it would take and what the salon owner would have to pull together to apply. And then, oh, by the way, every single one of the people who rents a booth from that beauty salon is equally eligible to apply and doesn't know it. So the nail technician, the women and men who are cutting hair are each their own businesses, and not aware that they should see themselves as a business. And that prompted us to say, well, you know what? One thing we can do, we know we have a ton of people at home with nothing to do or not enough to do, who would love to figure out a way to help without putting their lives, you know, and their health at risk. And we're like, one thing we can do is create a volunteer network and a business network where we can get our small community businesses to sign up if they want help, to get more information about what programs are available and how to apply, and train volunteers to field those calls and call them on the phone and work through that with them, make sure they understand where it is, which banks they can go to if their bank isn't participating, what they have to pull together. And the response has been really amazing. And I think it is something that the entire city needs. I do think Baltimore has a different model that the city government is undertaking. I think this is something that, one of the things we realized in this process is, city government doesn't even know who these small businesses are most of the time. And what I mean by that is they're not already in other city programs. So they're invisible, and there's no way for the city to say to them, hey, we're here and here's what we can offer you, or here is what you need to know exists. So this is something that we can do because we know our neighborhoods, we have local electeds who we can use to outreach. But the other part of this is, and I say this because Common Cause is an organizing group, and that's really important. And there's organizing to do here, which is organizing small businesses, not just to know what information and resources are available to them, but to know who they need to contact to demand what will really help them stay alive. And that means it's as important, not just that we share anecdotes, but we use this as a platform for helping those people be their own voices and helping those people say what they need. Because they're telling us we need rent and we need it to be a grant. We should be having them telling members of Congress or state officials.
So, I want to remind people, if you have questions for Maya, please put them in the chat and we will, get to them as we go along and get to the Q&A. Well, Maya, that actually brings us to one of the topics we at Common Cause have been, I would have to say, banging on now for a little bit. And that is the fact that our legislature is not in session. We have been really urging them to come back into session remotely. We've done a town hall about the technology that exists for them to conduct the people's business remotely and out in the open. We've held several press conferences. We provided them with information, and yet it's really very frustrating that, they are not legislating right now. They're relying on the governor, who's doing a great job of emergency triage, but executive orders are pretty blunt instruments, and the sorts of things that you're talking about actually need to be more detailed and thought through, because the programs that need to go into effect, it seems to me, are not just ones that we're going to have during a pause, but we're going to need to have for months, if not years, going into the future. It seems like it should be the beginning of solving some of these problems with a forward-thinking lens, and we need our legislators to be doing that work.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's sort of a natural cycle in something like this is this kind of the issues of what residents are experiencing are so dire that because I have seen some of our elected officials working so hard trying to figure out how to get food to people. We've got 4 times as many people, going to food banks, and food banks aren't able to meet the need by and large. So you have all these really immediate, drastic emergencies, and it's completely, I'm completely sympathetic to the struggle to figure out how to meet basic needs in a time of crisis. And I think you are absolutely right. This is now, if the governor is putting together a recovery task force, the mayor has just put together a recovery task force. Good for them for saying we have to start looking at recovery. But it's not just about, and we need our elected officials to convene, and you're absolutely right, they can convene remotely. City council's done it now.
Yeah.
Congress is going back physically to vote, as we know, and for crazy bad reasons. Mitch McConnell's calling the Senate back to move a very bad judge we should all complain about, Justin Walker. But so lots of legislating is sometimes happening, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. But there certainly are ways to do it safely. I think this moment of attention starting to turn to how are we slowly, rationally, and with health, public health in mind, going to start, quote unquote, reopening the economy is going to completely miss, if we just think about it from a health lens of, how many people can be in a space together is going to miss the fact that the business models, for example, for small businesses and self-employed businesses, they won't make their bottom line with a fraction of the people. But yes, if they're reopening, that's the only way they can reopen. Well, that's not a reopening strategy. And we shouldn't pretend it is, or that it somehow helps get the economy back on track. But it is an opportunity to say, okay, we have to protect public health first. Absolutely. And that means the state has to be fighting with the federal government, not just saying we can't go bankrupt because, you know, the Constitution, the Supreme Court has said, I'm gonna wear my legal hat right now. No, the state is precluded by Supreme Court precedent from declaring bankruptcy. It actually is required to pay its debts. Okay, that aside. So since that's the case, why is the legislature not pushing hard on the demands for the federal government? That's one piece of it, but also thinking about exactly this point about what is an equitable recovery that also makes sure that everyone in the state starts getting immediate needs met, but in a way that's investing in growing and prospering. And yes, recognizing that's going to mean some hard decisions, but those decisions should be principled decisions on investing in people. And why aren't we talking about how we generate more revenue to take care of people?
Yeah.
And so I'm absolutely with you. And I think, again, this is why I come back to, it's not just, the thing about small business owners is that they're not just small business owners. They're often low income or moderate and middle class residents who are just, you know, they're average folk just trying to live their lives. So this gives us a demand center for elected officials to be more engaged in being elected officials for the future.
Exactly. You know, sometimes I think that we have a tendency to think of a dichotomy between business and the people.
Yes.
And we forget about the small business owners, that they're in that category as well, because they're the people we interact with. They're the, you know, the Korean couple that runs the cleaner that I use, right? Or, you know, the folks at the corner bodega, and we don't think of them as business, but they are. And it seems to me, and we've got some questions about that, that at least from the federal perspective and to a certain degree from the state perspective as well, the money that's coming down is very much tilted towards the large corporations and not towards the small businesses at all. As you said, like the program set up that the first person in the door at the bank is always going to be those who have professionals to advise them. And that is actually, I think, not what most Americans expect is going to happen. And I was really fascinated by the fact that once there started to be publicity about some of the corporations, particularly the ones that are restaurant chains or involved in consumer goods of some kind, who were getting bailout money like Shake Shack, that they decided that they had to give it back. And so that tells you something about our power as consumers. You know, I've been in conversations where there's one steakhouse chain, I don't have to mention them on the call by name.
Ruth Chris?
Yeah,
I mean, I'm sorry. I didn't say it either.
So many friends who said, never eating there ever again. How dare they take public money at this time when, you know, the small business people you're talking about are going under. The restaurants, the individual restaurants are not going to be able to come back.
You know, one of the things I think we have to, you know, part of our problem in this country is we keep doing scarcity model, right? I mean, the reason that there's so little money in government is we've been cutting taxes. We won't go down this whole rabbit hole, but you all know what I'm talking about. I mean, we have reduced the revenue we generate in order to support the things we need to support. And that, but that, because there really are larger businesses that if it helps keep people on payroll, that's a good thing. But what we've done is we've created the system where it's an either or, because Congress hasn't said it shouldn't be an either or. We should just make sure we have enough money in, and that we design it in a way that meets the needs for employers who will really keep people on the books, this is important. And that is the way the program is supposed to be designed. I think that's a lot of what they considered when they designed it, was how to make sure these larger businesses actually keep paying people, but with no attention to the small businesses. And I think that, like in all things, it happens when we talk about whether we're going to get health care to undocumented immigrants, and then it becomes, well, what about all the citizens? We keep creating these us-thems that we could solve if we really made the principle. We want to keep as many people, businesses, with their doors open as we can. We want to make sure that's happening fairly and equitably in low-income communities, in the small mom and pop shops that are the backbone, and make sure there's a set aside for those types of businesses, and that it's structured so that they can access it. And then that's probably a different program from the restaurants that actually employ a lot of people, who will employ a lot of people who may be able to keep more people on the books. I think that's unfortunately not the way we have these conversations in this country, because some in government have decided that we're going to shrink the pie so small that it pits us against each other. We have the same problem with rural and urban, when frankly we share a lot of the same problems, and it really should not be a one or the other. It should be a both and.
Could not agree more. And I think, you've given us a lot to think about, and ways to adjust our expectations in terms of what we should be expecting the federal government, the state government, and the city government to do, that we can take forward into the conversations that we all have with elected officials, and just keeping this frame in mind, and really, an emphasis on it should not be a shrinking pie. This country is rich enough, we have enough assets, and there are decisions and choices that have been made that need to be adjusted. And it's our elected representatives who have to carry that forward. And the ones who already are expressing it need our support and our exhortation to fight harder. So
Hear, hear.
thank you so very much. Given us so much to think about as we continue to try and, get the recovery right and get the right message to our electeds. So I do want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the changes that have happened in the last week since we last spoke, in terms of updates on what's happening with elections and what we at Common Cause are doing to try and be sure that our democracy is protected to the maximum amount possible. As you know, as we've discussed several times in earlier town halls, the governor issued an executive order which expanded the ability to get an absentee ballot by appropriately defining illness very broadly, so that if you have a fear of getting sick or making somebody else ill, then that is a justified excuse under our constitutional framework. So that you can get an absentee ballot, which means virtually anybody in the state is now entitled to an absentee ballot. And he issued in the same executive order, said that you can apply online. You don't have to fill out a piece of paper with what we call a wet signature. And as I think we've discussed previously a couple of times, a lot of discussion about vote by mail, and could the state go to vote by mail? So last week we started hearing rumors, well, the governor was going to go to an all vote by mail system. No, he wasn't. We pushed back, quite frankly, fairly strenuously, and partners came forward as well to say it's a great aspiration, but it's not practical. So the governor ended up last week in issuing an executive order which requires that every registered voter, both active and inactive, has to receive a mailed absentee ballot application. And that's certainly, I think, a good compromise in terms of if you want to be sending things out to every voter rather than trying to send a ballot out to everybody. But as with executive orders, there are details that have to be filled in and questions that we have, as well as the fact that everything the governor has done only applies to the June primary. We suspect, unfortunately, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what the situation is going to be in November, but I think for a certainty that there are going to be voters, no matter what the health situation is, who are going to be very reluctant to go out and stand on a long line in order to vote. I could be wrong, but I suspect that even in November, there are some people who are going to be wary of crowds. And as we keep seeing over and over again, and as we hear from our election administrators across the state, running an election is pretty complicated and it needs a lot of advanced planning. So if we are going to have expanded absentee, if we are going to be able to ask for absentee ballots on the internet through email, if people are going to be mailed absentee ballot applications in November, how much better the entire process would be if our boards of elections knew to start planning now. So we've just completed drafting and getting through the approval process with our coalition partners, a set of recommendations to the legislature that we're going to deliver to them tomorrow that really detail the kinds of changes in our election law that we think need to happen now in order for our democracy to be protected and our voting rights to be assured going forward. So basically, what we're asking is to continue the expansion on absentee balloting for the November election. So we want to streamline and expand absentee balloting for November. That's got to be a law change. We want to make it easier to receive and cast an absentee ballot, particularly by voters who have disabilities, but for everybody as well. And we have a bunch of technical suggestions on how to do that. We believe that there needs to be some law changes, temporary or permanent, to clarify and ensure that that voters' absentee ballots will be counted. And we believe that during this emergency, there should be a doubling of the number of days that we have early voting, and that the hours and locations for early voting should be increased, because early voting disperses voters and really helps to minimize the possibility of crowding. So we're delivering that to the legislature tomorrow, and we're going to be talking to them, and it's part of our ongoing campaign to get them to actually go back into session remotely and address these urgent issues. As we know, the presidential primary, which was consolidated with the June 23rd congressional and legislative primaries, has been canceled. And we've gotten various questions about what Common Cause's position is on that. And I'll tell you honestly, we have not taken a position on whether or not the presidential primary should have been canceled, but we are concerned that there really isn't an established legal standard to decide when somebody has substantially withdrawn their campaign, and that the rules are being made up on the fly, which is never a good idea. And what we believe is that there needs to be a nonpartisan, uniform standard. Our state has a lot of issues regarding when somebody stays on the ballot or comes off the ballot. And this is another issue which we believe we need the legislature to provide clarity on. And also there is currently a lawsuit pending, which is going to resolve the issue of whether or not it was appropriate for the state board to take this action. And we're going to, wait and see what the courts do. So we've got actually a poll which we've put together, which we're going to put up regarding the questions that we'd like some insight from you in terms of the issues that you're most concerned about during this pandemic. And so we have a poll that we're going to ask you to answer. And for those of you who have signed in through the website, through Zoom, I've just made the poll live and it's going to pop up on your screen. And we're going to ask you to please, going to give you 15 seconds to read through and give us your answers to the poll. And I believe there's also a link for people who don't have it pop up on the screen. And we're asking you, what are your greatest concerns regarding the COVID-19 crisis? Are you concerned the post office will be closed, that the November general election will be postponed, that federal aid to cities and states will be tied to immigration policy or sanctuary city status? Is your biggest concern that stay-at-home restrictions will be lifted too early, or that huge amounts of stimulus money is going to corporations and wealthy individuals and not to the people and small businesses that need it the most? They're all pretty urgent issues. I know it's hard to prioritize, but we're asking you, what is your greatest concern? So that can help us and influence the policy choices and the actions that we are recommending that you take. And so let's see, we've got the poll, and I'm going to give you 3 counts to make your vote. 1, 2, 3, and we're going to end it. And people definitely were answering more than one, I think. So we've got 62% of the people who are concerned the Postal Service will be closed. 62% the November general election will be postponed. And that might be something, before we take questions of Maya, you and I can talk about a little bit. 43% are concerned about federal aid being tied to immigration policies. 57% are concerned that stay-at-home restrictions will be lifted too early. And I would say that the largest concern, 76%, is huge amounts of stimulus money going to corporations of wealthy individuals and not to people in small businesses that need it the most. So thank you for that input. Mike, before we go to Q&A, just a short question for you. What about the fear that the November election could be postponed? You're a lawyer and you comment on these things. I thought we might as well get your input.
Yeah. You know, the thing is, Donald Trump can't stop the November election from happening. That only an act of Congress can do that. Personally, I don't see that happening politically. I think a bigger concern is exactly the things that you were talking about already, Susan. It's how states are going to ensure that it's a fair and equitable election. I think that is my biggest fear, not whether it's going to be moved from November, but how it's going to happen in November, and whether or not we see huge amounts of voter suppression, whether or not we see tampering, and whether or not there are sufficient resources, because a lot of states that are committed to doing it right and doing it well are already saying they don't have the resources to shift to doing a vote by mail effectively and safely, and the kinds of things they have to do to get ready and to invest in a fair process that ensures that everyone has equal access to the ballot. So I have a lot of concerns about that. I have a lot of concerns about the Postal Service for this reason. So I think there are a lot of concerns about November. I am much more worried about how we are starving states or enabling and not paying attention to whether states are taking unfair advantage of the situation to benefit one party or another.
Yeah. So less concern about the feds postponing the election, but vigilance to be sure that voter suppression doesn't undercut the right to vote. Okay. So here's some questions. So in terms of talking about small businesses and helping them out, one question that we've gotten from Sam, wouldn't expanding resources for organizations like the business improvement districts, the BIDs, and local community development corps to educate on economic equity help. He points out that several outer borough BIDs have been organizing to advocate for new American small businesses.
So I think this, first of all, I would say it's a both and. I think as a matter of structure, you can't get what small businesses need by only paying attention to the capacity building supports to get information out. I think that's critically important. So this is a yes to that. The problem that we have is, first of all, some little neighborhood segments don't have bids. We don't have the capacity in every single low-income community necessarily to just build that up. But even if we did, they're still going to hit some of the same roadblocks if we're not also changing how the programs are structured so that more businesses can get through them. It's a little bit like what the conversation that we had after the Great Recession, when there were all these questions about how to help, low-income homeowners that were underwater, and a lot of people said financial literacy. And the reality is, of course, financial literacy is a hugely important skill set to help people have, but it wasn't going to change the conditions under which whether they were going to be able to refinance their homes if they were more literate necessarily. So you want both. You really want both. You want a structure of capacity and support, but it has to be for the right mechanisms to get access to the funds. So one of the good things that that Congress did, led by our New York delegation, was say you have to set aside some of the small business money for our credit unions, for our community development finance institutions, because they're the ones on the ground in a lot of these communities who are better able to serve them. That was a good step. It wasn't enough, but it was a really good step in a context in which Republicans were not playing ball. Unfortunately, it was very party driven. So I say that to say you got to do both.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in my experience in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, there are businesses that are just too small to actually pay the fee for the bid. And I know that's been a tension in some areas in Queens, some areas in Brooklyn, where, newer businesses are coming in, they set up a bid, they've got the ability to contribute to it, and the smaller businesses just are not able to. So absolutely both.
And language barrier, we didn't say this, but language barrier, we forget that really small businesses sometimes don't speak English, and therefore some of the capacity we need to support people through both getting the information and through the process is language capacity. So that's something to think about as well.
Mm-hmm. So there was a question from Donna who wanted to know, is it correct that small businesses can borrow money that they have to pay back, but the corporations are bailed out with money that they won't have to pay back under the federal funding?
Yes and no. And what I mean by that is there are two different kinds of bail. So there's a bailout, like the bailout for the airline industry. That was a bailout. And then there's relief money, and then there's some specific small business programs to which businesses apply for loans. In one instance, a program is a loan that can be converted to a grant. So I think part of why people get confused is there are a couple of different funding pools. So there's the mega corporation, too big to fail, for lack of a better way of putting it, like the airlines. And then there's the small business grants, which were for businesses that met the Small Business Administration's definition of a small business. And part of what happened, and part of why it's confusing, is the definition of small business generally is 500 employees or less. So we know when we're talking about our neighborhood mom and pop shops, we're talking about 5 employees or less, not 500. But if you are a restaurant, and so you're a chain, and you have a restaurant over here in this neighborhood and then another restaurant over there in the other neighborhood, they're considered affiliates. So maybe you have 10,000 employees if you totaled up all your affiliates. But each affiliate, if it has 500 employees or less, is you can apply, you can add them together. So this is my point about the structure of the program. So it's how and there's some industries that may have more than 500 employees just by definition, what kind of business it is. So there are a couple of other exceptions. So it makes it very complicated and confusing, which is why I say, we really have to think about what are programs for small community-based businesses, because that is not how this was shaped.
Yeah, definitely. We've got some questions that relate to the election changes here in New York State. Question, what about from Carol? What about Cuomo's executive order canceling special elections for 4 vacancies in the state legislature? Well, Carol, actually, Common Cause recommended to the governor that he do exactly the opposite, that the special elections were what should go forward, and that the primary and special elections should be combined and run under the special election rules, because that would fill the vacancies more promptly and would have put an end to what we saw as the purposeless anti-democratic fighting over ballot petitioning to get on the ballot. The governor obviously decided to go in a different direction. It was not what we had been supporting. And that happens. But that our position was combine it and go with the special rules.
Thank
A
you for
comment.
the explanation. It's a little complicated, but thank you.
Yeah. A comment from Tay Revez. For early voting, we need to add locations, not just days. Totally agree. We have a 3-part ask on early voting that we believe the legislature should pick up at least through 2020. Let's not have this one set of rules for June and then we have to go out November. And that is that we should double the number of days. We should increase the minimum hours for each day. And we should increase the minimum number of locations. Because, we worked so hard to pass early voting, and it is an excellent tool for this situation. And I'm sad to say that at the last state Board of Elections meeting, one of the commissioners, and you can guess which party he's from, but let's not go down that rabbit hole, commented about how, well, now that we have to mail absentee ballot applications to everybody, we can cut back on early voting. Well, our response is no, it's exactly the opposite. And I'm happy to say that one of the other commissioners spoke up and said, no, that is absolutely the wrong way to go. We need to continue and expand early voting, but that is something which the legislature has to do. So here's a comment from Ida. Many scientists expect that there will be another wave of the pandemic in the fall. So the expectation that the election in November will involve social distancing. Yes, there are definitely those predictions out, and that's why we're emphasizing let's set one set of rules for absentee voting for now through the end of the year, so that we have clarity, so the boards of elections don't get confused and we don't have different rules for signature verification in one county than we have in another. Let's eliminate the gamesmanship that we see played over deciding whether an absentee ballot can be cast or not. We're going to have a big expansion in absentee balloting, and we hope you will help us get the word out to voters about the options that they have in June and November. Then we're going to see a lot more absentee ballots, and we have to streamline the procedures so that when you are relying on an absentee ballot, there is much less of a chance that your ballot will not be qualified and will not be cast. So that's why we have our set of recommendations, and we're going to put the recommendations that we're sending to the legislature up on our website and up on the Let New York Vote website sometime tomorrow, so you can take a look at them. They get pretty detailed and they talk about specific election law sections that need to be changed. So they're pretty technical, but the basic idea is we need to be sure that we minimize the possibility that anybody will be disenfranchised in June or in November. And we have to be sure that our elections are run in a uniform way throughout the state, and that we do everything we can to be sure that people who want to vote at home have the ability to do that, and those who want to vote in person will be able to do so safely. There's another question that came up, I think, for, nope, nope, disappeared, sorry, okay. Here it is, okay. This will be more for you, Maya. Maybe there needs to be further categorization of small businesses to businesses with 10 or less employees, or some reasonable number that is fairer to the smallest of small businesses. How can that be done?
I completely agree with that. And that's part of what I was talking about when I was saying a set-aside program. I mean, create a program designed and defined by the types of businesses we're talking about. The way that would be done is the Congress, when it does a package, could literally include that in the definitions for the package, meaning it could say, it did this with the Paycheck Protection Program, which is one of the ones we're primarily talking about today. That really, it was a brand new program. It hadn't existed before. They created it specifically for this. That means they could say, we're going to create a rent protection program, or payroll and rent protection program for micro businesses, and then define micro, and then define the process, like something that makes sure that they get through the process, and hopefully provide some of the right capacity supports for them to do that. And then you can have a separate program for larger small businesses. I'm not suggesting that PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program that we've been discussing, was bad. It was just not good for the businesses we're talking about. But it was good for larger small businesses. And, so you can keep it that way as is for those businesses for whom they have banking relationships. They're larger. It will help them stay in business. We need them to stay in business. So it can absolutely be done through the legislation. At the city level, I think it's really incumbent upon us to think about how, and by city, that's not just New York City. It could be Syracuse. It could be Rochester. It could be whatever rural entities exist for rural businesses. But it's like, what kinds of programs do they add on top that ensure that businesses are getting helped by multiple layers of government to build on the additional things they need that maybe the federal government's just not as good at, but the organs of government that are closer to the ground are much better at. And sometimes that capacity support is better in local government. So give local governments some ability to provide those on the ground supports.
Exactly. Thank you. Thanks for that answer. So I'm going to ask you to answer another survey. This one's a survey, not a poll. And we're going to put the link up in the chat that you can then click on and answer the survey. We really appreciate the activism of all of our members, and we want to continue to engage you. And so we are asking you to let us know which of the following actions you are willing to take. To join our action team, which is the super volunteers who want to take more actions and get more involved in some of our activities. Join our Democracy Book Club, and we're just about finalizing the list of books that we're going to be recommending. Join our Democracy Watch group, and we've been having a really terrific time going through movies and documentaries. The problem is there are way too many, and culling it down to a manageable list that makes sense has taken us a little time. Participate in a postcard writing Get Out the Vote campaign. We're going to be doing that for both June and November, where we aren't able to leaflet, where we, the question is, how can we contact voters? And a postcard campaign is a very satisfying way to get the word out, and it supports the Postal Service as well. And finally, are you willing to write a letter to the editor demanding the legislature do its job and pass laws remotely? And you can do that on our website, and we will automatically send your comments and your demand that they get back to work remotely and legislate to your state representatives. So that really, I think, covers what we had to discuss today. I want to thank Maya for joining us and giving us a lot to think about and a framework in which to really carry our work forward. And to all of you for joining us this week, and hope that we see you next week when we will have another guest speaker and take on another set of issues that are important for the health of our democracy and our society's recovery during this difficult time. So thank you all. Please answer our survey, and we're going to be in touch with you in terms of ongoing actions like letter writing and postcard campaigns as we move forward and really work on all of these important issues in the future. So thanks, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for all your important work. It's so important. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Maya. Take care, everybody. Bye.